Welcome to the Maritime Matters podcast. Did you know that 98% of Australia's trade passes through the maritime domain? 91% of its fuel is imported, and Australia's exclusive economic zone is larger than its mainland. It's easy to see that to Australia, maritime matters. Maritime Matters is the podcast where we break down what the week's events mean for Australia's maritime security and the wider Indo-Pacific. Welcome to this episode of Maritime Matters. We're recording on the 5th of July, morning of the 5th of July. So, Jen, what have you been up to talking about so far this week?
Yeah, hey Richard, good to see you online. It's been 2 weeks. We do endeavour to get Maritime Matters to you every week, but sometimes it just doesn't come to fruition. Richard Dunley is too popular. He's too busy.
I don't know about that. You're the jet-setting one normally.
Yes, well. Anyway, what have I been up to this week? We'll get to this in a little bit, but I've had a piece out in the AFR rebutting a piece from James Curran that kind of rips apart AUKUS, so we'll talk to that a little bit later. Also had a piece up on my website that was out in the latest edition of the Australian Foreign Affairs, which was rebutting Hugh White's piece. So for those that followed the AUKUS debate, in February this year, Hugh White released a piece about 46 pages having a go at all things AUKUS in the Australian Foreign Affairs. So myself and a number of others, including my dear colleague Justin Burke and of course Peter Dean, had a rebuttal to that. So you can find that on my website. And then finally, with lots of great peer reviewing and editing from Richard Dunley, I have a piece out in the Australian Naval Review, which you can access via the Australian Naval Institute's website. On USVs in the Black Sea, talking about how it's more of an evolution, not a revolution in naval warfare. What about you, Richard?
Well, firstly, really glad that the USV piece is out. That's excellent. Well worth a look if you get the opportunity. I've got to catch up on those commentaries in the AFR. Conferencing, I was chaired a great panel yesterday at the Australian Historical Association conference on the Royal Australian Navy. So it's really good to see that side of things, certainly from my perspective as a historian, that side of things picking up quite nicely. But I'm also hopefully going to have something out on more broadly on Australia and the United States hopefully later on this week. We'll maybe talk about that very briefly next week if we do manage to get our weekly episode out next week. So, what's been happening in the world of maritime and beyond over the past week to 2 weeks, Jen?
Lots have been happening. I think, when we first started the idea for this podcast, we were like, we'll do a weekly update. We might run out of topics. We'll try and get 35 minutes. And I think we've found that every week there is actually just so much that there's a whole heap of things we miss. So there's been lots happening, for example, in the Red Sea and the Gulf of Aden, but we won't talk about that today. So what has been happening, I think the biggest thing is RIMPAC. So the largest maritime exercise in the world has kicked off in the vicinity of Hawaii. So it happens every 2 years. It is a great run ashore, also a great warfare exercise. But there's been a little bit of controversy in Australia about Australia's contingent to RIMPAC and what that says about Australia's operational capability in the maritime domain. Richard, do you want to tell us a little bit about RIMPAC?
So RIMPAC is the premier kind of global naval exercise, by far I think the largest in the world. It's been running for sort of 50 odd years now.
1971. Cheap.
There you go.
1971.
Excellent.
I didn't go to the 1971 iteration, unfortunately.
So this edition has 29 nations, 40 surface ships, 3 submarines. That was a point of some interest. Only 3 submarines. Normally, the ratio of surface ships to submarines is slightly different. 14 different national land forces, so armies and marines. 150 aircraft, 25,000 personnel. So this is a big deal. And some of the kit that's there is really quite significant. I saw one of the US Nimitz class carriers is currently in Pearl, and I think is slated or expected to be taking part as well as a whole host of other capabilities. I thought it was quite interesting that the air component of the exercise is being commanded by Air Commodore Louise Desjardins from the Royal Australian Air Force, with that kind of significant and senior Australian involvement is there. But there has been something of a I described it as a stoush or a sort of argument or question being raised about Australian involvement, and I'm gonna handball it to you to see what your hot takes are on this. Is this the fact that Australia is not sending as much as we want? Is this a major issue, or is this a storm in a teacup?
Well, I feel like I potentially started this storm on the ABC on Monday. Maybe I didn't, but that seemed to be the first mention of the issue. Before I get to that, though, I just want to talk a little bit more about RIMPAC, because it is fantastic that Australia is commanding the Air Component Commander, and I actually think this is the first time Australia has ever done that. What is interesting, though, is historically Australia is actually in command of the Maritime Component Commander. Certainly, as long as my memory goes, we have commanded that. This year we're not, and it's actually been commanded by the JMSDF, which I thought was interesting, and haven't had the time to do the research, but I think that might be a first. So I think that's interesting. And yes, less submarines, and then predominantly because Australia isn't sending a submarine, which Australia normally does. So I guess getting into the Australian contingent, so Australia sent 320 personnel, including HMAS Sydney and a P8 crew. And why this has kind of raised some eyebrows in terms of participation is because Australia is actually a founding participant of RIMPAC. So joined at the first ever RIMPAC, has actually attended every single iteration of RIMPAC. In 2022, Australia sent its largest contingent. Well, that's what the reporting said at the time. I actually don't think it was Australia's largest contingent, but the reporting said it was. And so in 2022, we sent over 1,600 personnel, 3 ships, P8, and a submarine, or something in the order of that. And in fact, going back to at least 2014, we'd been sending well over 700. And from a ship's perspective, normally it is a tanker, a frigate or a destroyer, and potentially an LHD, or if not, another frigate and a destroyer. And so I think this scaled down contingents, 1,600 last year. In fact, even during COVID. So during COVID in 2020, we made a point of sending 4 ships. Those poor people didn't get any port visits for that long deployment, and that would have been horrendous. And still around 1,600 people. So it is significant that it's quite a scaled down number. And a lot of those numbers actually come from, not all, but the reduction numbers actually come from the Navy support to the exercise. And so I think, is it a big deal that we're not sending a large contingent to RIMPAC? So on the face of things, no. But then when you ask the question about why, I think that becomes a big deal, right? And it's something we've talked about and we already know. But the why is the operational availability of the RAN's ships. So we spoke last time about the 2 tankers that the RAN has, Supply and Stalwart. Both are out of action. Traditionally, the RAN has always sent a tanker to Hawaii, predominantly because it's very hard to get across the Pacific without a tanker. And so really kind of the small contingent in the RIMPAC is kind of the manifestation of what we've always known, which is the reduction in operational availability of the RAN. And so I think it is a real issue. Is it a stoush? I don't know. I think it's just a point to highlight. It was fantastic in February this year to see the increased investment in the Royal Australian Navy's capabilities, so the expansion of the fleet. But I think that it's often glossed over that that's not coming until the 30s, and actually what we're seeing is a reduction and a fleet that's hurting at a critical time. What are your thoughts on it? Why do you call it a stoush?
Maybe I used the wrong word there at this early time in the morning, but it seemed like there was quite a little bit of media interest, and then a number of politicians and others jumped on the bandwagon to try and use this as a stick with which to beat the current government, which I found frankly rather amusing, considering none of these decisions that are sort of playing out in terms of the operational availability of the RN have any particular relationship or specific relationship to this government. Indeed, a lot of them don't have much relationship to the coalition government before them. So you can be going back at least a decade, if not more. The idea that these are this is something that is Miles' fault, I found frankly a bit absurd. And then having some of the former defence officials who were involved in defence at the time many of these decisions were made, coming up and saying how dreadful it was, I find perhaps slightly hypocritical. But maybe I'm being harsh. I don't know.
No, I think you're right. And I, to give a bit of a plug, there was an ABC fact check out last week by Matt Moran, and we'll put it in the show notes, that quotes a number of esteemed naval thinkers, including Peter Jones, Jack McCaffrey, and I think Jen Parker's in there somewhere. I don't think she's an esteemed naval thinker, but she's in there. That talks about actually the age of the fleet, and it talks about the fact that the way you end up in this position is subsequent governments over decades not making decisions and not realising the importance of the maritime domain. So I agree with you wholeheartedly.
What are we doing? We keep agreeing with each other.
Podcast.
This is no good, right? We'll have to find something to disagree on. I guess at least a little bit within that, I would push back a little bit on the idea that this is sort of a real sign of the fact, sort of a lack of commitment or anything else that some of these things have been suggested. I think there is a degree to which this is something of a storm in a teacup, but it's the bigger signal, the bigger issues underneath that are the problem, particularly when we keep talking about issues like deterrence. We love talking about deterrence, but deterrence comes from capability. And if you keep effectively signalling that you don't have that capability available, that is a problem.
So I agree, and I think we also just need to make the quick point that it's not just about numbers of ships. I mean, there is a problem in terms of the numbers of surface combatants. There's no problem in terms of the operational capability of the replenishment ships. But also the RAN has historically sent large contingents, for example, of mine clearance divers and other areas. And it looks like that those areas, although less talked about because it's harder to quantify, are also experiencing pressure. So I think it's a broader issue about capability than just the numbers of ships.
Yep. And ultimately, a lot of it comes down to people. What else, Jen, has been happening in the region over the past week or so that's caught your attention?
You're right. Look, there's been a couple of interesting things. One that just kind of warrants a passing mention, but it looks like the first trilateral between Japan, Australia, and the UK actually took place in the Pacific with HMS Tamar, so one of the UK's OPVs that's deployed to Singapore under the Indo-Pacific tilt. I wonder if that'll stay after the elections occurring today in the UK, but who knows? Had an exercise with a JMSDF vessel that's heading to the Pacific, and also HMAS Chills. So I thought that was interesting. I think the other big major thing that we need to talk about is that there were talks between the Philippines and China this week, which I think is really, really good. Often on this show, we talk a lot about the latest escalation in the West Philippine Sea, the latest degree of China's aggressive behaviour towards the Philippines. So I think it's really good to see these talks. These talks actually were instigated in 2017, so it's not a new concept, but they have been cancelled a number of times. So they went ahead. In terms of what came out of them, look, it's not entirely clear. It looks like there was an agreement signed to improve communications during emergencies at sea. There's a lot of agreements in Southeast Asia on emergencies at sea, so I wouldn't put too much weight on this, but still, communications is good. And it looks like both sides have agreed to continue talks on enhancing ties between their coast guards, but there's no kind of further details. There was some stuff there about a confidence-building plan with convening an academic forum among scientists and academics to improve maritime scientific cooperation between the two countries. And I think often at the moment when we talk about confidence building in the maritime domain in Southeast Asia, really the approach is, well, how do you find the things that you do agree on? And start cooperating there. So look, that's all positive. I don't necessarily think that there's going to be much that changes in the region in response to that. There was some reporting, I struggled to verify it before this podcast, but there was some reporting that President Marcos had directed his armed forces, including the Coast Guard, to de-escalate tensions in the West Philippine Sea. I'm not really sure how they necessarily do that because a lot of that escalation is coming from China. But either way, I think that was quite an interesting development. Any thoughts on the talks between China and the Philippines?
I mean, I'm deeply skeptical about a lot of the specific outcomes of these kind of things. I'm an academic forum amongst scientists talking about marine scientific cooperation. Well, you look at a lot of what's happening on these kind of reefs, marine scientific cooperation doesn't seem to be top of anyone's particular agenda. But I think it's the mere fact that this is happening that is actually what is significant. Now, we don't quite know what's happened behind the scenes in terms of relationships between Manila and Washington, but I suspect there were some quite significant kind of communications in the light of the most recent incidents. So whether or not there's been any kind of pressure or desire for the Philippines to at least be seen to take something of a step back, I think is... We won't know, but it's interesting to see that relationship and the sort of the direct, relatively rapid shift in at least some of the narratives. But also, it indicates that China is willing to at least come to the table and be seen to be engaging in this type of thing. Now, we have no idea whether or not that's going to relate into action on the water, but I think it has to be seen as a positive sign after what's been a couple of months of pretty significant kind of ramping up of escalation. And I think, as we talked about in our last podcast, it felt like there wasn't quite a lot of space to go in terms of escalation before something quite significant happened. A stepping back from the edge feels like it's something that's significant and positive, even if the tangibles are not necessarily that real, I think. Moving on, talking about capability, you've been involved in discussions on the AUKUS debate, and you mentioned earlier about the fact you've had a piece out. Do you want to kick us off on what I suspect will be something that we will talk about ad infinitum?
We will need to keep it short. Look, so I think there's been continuous debate in Australia around AUKUS, and specifically AUKUS Pillar 1, which is the plan for Australia to acquire nuclear-powered submarines announced in September 21. This week in the Australian Financial Review, there has been an investigation series, I can't remember what they called it, talking about how AUKUS Pillar 1 had first been agreed. I think it was referred to as Scott Morrison's Long Night or something like that. And then a second piece talking about other options for AUKUS Pillar 1. I think for the first piece, I'd recommend to all of you to read it. I think it's really important to see all ends and all sides of the AUKUS debate. It's a very expensive project. It's a very risky project. I thought the first piece really did a bit of discredit to the Department of Defence. It's easy to throw stones at the Department of Defence, but the assumption that there was very limited analysis before that decision, I think, is a little bit unfair. I know you might have different views, and the assumption that it was just a Prime Minister's thought bubble, I think, also is unfair. And I think you've got to remember agendas too, right? So when you read these pieces, with no disrespect intended to our previous PM, we are seeing a lot in the AUKUS debate, whether it be Malcolm Turnbull or Scott Morrison, PMs trying to shore up their legacy, right? And so for me, there was a lot of this was my great idea, etc. from the PM. And I talk about this all the time with AUKUS, but for me, the nuclear-powered submarine debate in the REN and the ADF actually goes back a very long way. So it's been a long discussion. The second one proposed a plan B from a group called Submarines for Australia. I think that's a new name for that group. I've heard of this group before, but I hadn't heard of them going by that name until I saw the piece. And effectively, they say that the current optimal pathway, which is challenging, right? It is challenging, and I don't think that the view that we'll have Collins class operating until the late 30s is probably likely, but still, I don't think we need to. It proposes a plan B where instead of buying Virginia class submarines in the 30s, so the 3 that we're planning to get from 2032, and then building SSN AUKUS with the UK, it proposes that we just get a license from the US to build Virginia class Block 7 in Australia in the 30s and have the first one in the water from 2038. My piece that came out kind of attacked the series on 2 points. The first point, which I think I might have even stolen the idea from you, Richard. I want to put that up there. Richard had a really good piece out with USSC in the AUKUS debate series, and I think that you and I have discussed it a bit. But it was talking about how much skin in the game the UK really has in AUKUS. And I thought that in the investigation series, they kind of said, oh, well, this is not really that important to the UK. We're just propping up their industrial base. They don't matter. So my piece really talks about the fact that, one, the AUKUS SSN is crucial to the UK's strategic deterrent. I won't get into all of that, but read the piece. And two, the UK's involvement is crucial to Australia for many reasons. But the key reason I talk about in the piece is the fact that the UK was obviously influential in influencing the US to agree to this decision, and previously the US had declined. In fact, a number of times in our history, the US had declined. And the UK, I've said, is like an insurance policy, because when you have a trilateral with invested partners, it's much harder to pull out than when you have a bilateral with the US. Those are kind of the key points. Read the piece. Richard, what's your take on the investigation series?
So I have slightly different views on the origins of AUKUS to you. I am not a huge fan of the way in which the decision was made. I don't agree with the analysis. I must say that I think there was sort of clear, coherent thinking behind this. If you look at the scale of the decision, this has fundamentally shifted Australia's foreign policy, Australia's grand strategy, on Australia's industrial policy, and ultimately it comes out of a decision taken around a single part of defence capability.
Mm-hmm.
We know that there wasn't a lot of consultation about impact on foreign policy, for example. Scott Morrison openly kind of celebrates that fact, which even that, to my mind, is sort of deeply problematic. So I have a lot of issues over how the decision was made. Whether or not it's the right decision is a very different question as to whether the decision-making process was correct. And I think that's an important kind of distinction to draw. The Plan B stuff that was outlined in the second piece, I think, is a pipe dream. The idea of building nuclear submarines in Australia to be operational and commissioned and operational by 2038 seemed like a pipe dream when Scott Morrison mentioned it in 2021, which is why we had this whole debate about interim capabilities, interim submarines, which is how we ultimately ended up with acquiring a bunch of Virginia classes. And the reason why the optimal pathway is so complicated is in many ways precisely because they couldn't work out a way to do this, right? And it's no more plausible now. In fact, it's distinctly less plausible 3 years on than it was in 2021. Mm-hmm. So it's not going to happen. And I don't understand really quite what the drivers are. The desire to cut the UK out, which is sort of to some degree seems to be the main driver, again, is just a bit odd. I'm not saying the UK submarine industrial base is in a great place. It's not. None of the logic behind it doesn't seem to be there. Certainly not in the way it was presented in the AFR. Yeah, interesting debate. I think it's good to be having more debate. I've often flagged that I think that AUKUS, there is a significant debate, despite people claiming there's not one. But one of the big issues is that generally people have been talking past each other. It's good to see more of this. And in fact, with that in mind, people who listen to this might well be interested in a debate that's coming up, I think, next week, being run by La Trobe between Pete Dean and Hugh White, which should be fiery. So if you're interested in that kind of thing, maybe have a look and take a look at that.
So just one point, I just want to correct one point on my position, so my position is clear. I know we want to disagree because it makes it more entertaining. I actually don't disagree. I don't think that the development of AUKUS Pillar 1 was optimal. And I really do think it's an example of capability driving strategy. And I think that and the announcement of the fleet review has actually developed an incoherent maritime capability for Australia. But that doesn't belay the fact that I think there was more analysis within defence than James Curran gives them credit for. But anyway, moving on, because we're trying to keep these short.
You were talking about the arrival of another kind of AUKUS-related thing, an arrival of the US submarine tender. We love submarine tenders. Well, we do love
submarine tenders. In fact, Australia used to have submarine tenders. I'm sure the historian will know the dates and times of that. I don't. But we did used to have them. And there is a genuine question, I think Ewan Graham has raised it, about Is this something that we should consider? And the answer is yes.
Late
But
great James Goldrick was a massive submarine tender fan, so
he was. So the Emery S Land has arrived in Sydney. So I mean, this isn't not new. It's been doing a bit of a tour of Australia. It went to Darwin, then it went to Cairns. So it's got about 500 crew, 17 of which are RAN members. And this is part of the plan to increase both defence industry and the ADF's ability to understand and maintain nuclear-powered submarines. So it'll make its way to WA. We know that there's a plan where there'll be a major maintenance period, or sorry, it's not called a major maintenance period, but whatever, medium-level maintenance period, whatever the term is. Some maintenance, in-water maintenance on a submarine, in-water maintenance because we have no dry dock in WA, but that's another controversial point that we won't talk about here. In this year, right? And that's part of the upskilling Australian capability in preparation for Surf West commencing in 2027. So I think that's really cool. And it arrived in Sydney on the 4th of July, which I think is great. There must have been a party. I didn't get invited. I don't think you got invited. So, yeah, offended by that.
Absolutely.
What else is happening in capability?
Something else that we mentioned and got excited, not least by the name a few weeks ago, was the Royal Navy testing a directed energy weapon, which to sort of in common parlance, I think I'd describe as a laser, but maybe I'm completely sort of doing down of what's actually going on here. Something called Dragonfire. Again, like what an awesome name. So the Dragonfire directed energy weapon, we got something out from a question in Parliament, written question for the UK Department of Defence, which stated, and the response stated that the Royal Navy is going to begin integrating this properly onto vessels from 2027, with the goal of achieving full operational capability by 2030. So still a little way away, but we're not that far away, and these are seen as some sort of pretty significant developments in terms of some of the issues that have been raised around the comparative cost of missiles used to destroy drones, for example, and these sorts of things. Now, there are still a lot of issues, particularly around the range of these types of things. These are effectively more close-in weapon systems, so do you want to rely on them to destroy something? A whole host of issues. Power issues, something I would flag with regard to Hunter. You need lots and lots of power for these things. So you need a large surplus of power. Anyway, we're going on down rabbit holes there. But this is a technology that has been being talked about certainly for as long as I've been interested in maritime stuff. It's been coming, and it's always been about 2 years away, and now finally it seems like it might actually be coming. So I thought that was interesting.
No, I think that is interesting. Very interesting. I'm very excited about it. I think it has a great name too. I hope that maybe we can get something agreed under AUKUS Pillar 2 for that to be fitted on RAN ships, although unlikely the Hunter for the reasons that you highlight. One other capability thing, and then we better move on. Just briefly, so we did talk a number of episodes ago about the US deployment of a Typhoon to the Philippines. It was always expected to be kind of a short-term thing to support a number of exercises. It did rattle China.
So this is the Typhoon mid-range missile that can fire Tomahawks and SM-6, right?
You're absolutely right. You are much better at this podcasting than I am. That's what we're talking about. Right, so that was deployed to the Philippines by the US a couple of months ago now. I think maybe April or May. But anyway, it was always expected to be temporary. It did rattle China quite a bit. China got upset in a number of forums about this deployment, including it being mentioned in Shangri-La. Russia also remarked on it. And so the Philippines have said in the last week, I think unrelated to their talks with China, but that Typhoon capability is expected to return back to the US in September. So not really significant because it was expected to be temporary, but I think that's interesting. So that mid-range missile from the US will now be exiting the Indo-Pacific theater again.
But highly mobile, seemingly has, as you say, rattled some cages, so in many ways potentially done its job.
Send a message, that's for sure, right? And that's what signalling anti-deterrence is all about.
Yep. And I think it's really interesting how these land-based systems are beginning to really affect and play out a lot more into the maritime domain. But that's something that I've been talking about and writing about for a little while now.
You have. And in fact, look, there's no time to talk about this week, but there was a comment from a very senior Marine, I think from Indo-PACOM this week, talking about how I don't agree with this comment. But sea control in the Pacific will be achieved by the Marines and these kind of weapons. I think that's not understanding the concept of sea control, but still interesting thinking. Anyway, we probably should move on. Now, before we move to the Did You Know, I did want to acknowledge two things that have happened in Australia this week, to two senior command handovers in Australia that loosely impact the maritime domain. So the Chief of Air Force, Air Vice Marshal Chipman, has handed over to Air Vice Marshal Chappell, which, if you follow cricket, which I don't, apparently is a really significant name and a really significant thing. But Air Vice Marshal Chipman is now heading off to be the Vice Chief of the Defence Force, starting in the role in the change of the hierarchy. So we'll see the Chief of the Defence Force hand over shortly. To Admiral Johnson, so, our first naval Chief of Defence Force, I think, in 20 years. Obviously, the Navy's been out of that rotation for a long time. But also, I'm very excited about this because she's a very dear friend. But Major General Susan Coyle is now Lieutenant General Susan Coyle, and has taken over from Lieutenant General Fruin as the Chief of Joint Capabilities. And so it's the first time that we have had a female domain lead, which is great. And congratulations to Susan Coyle. It is fantastic to see now 3 female 3-stars in the Australian Army. And we did talk last week in this podcast about my recent piece about whether the other services, particularly the Navy, should start to follow suit. So anyway, moving on to Did You Know? What do you know this week, Richard?
So this week we're going to talk a little bit about Australian aviation, naval aviation, particularly the acquisition of aircraft carriers. Many of you may know that Australia did, for a significant chunk of the Cold War, operate aircraft carriers, HMAS Sydney and HMAS Melbourne, and these formed the kind of the core, in many ways, of certainly the early and mid-Cold War Royal Australian Navy. But we think it's quite interesting to be thinking about these kind of evolutions of fleet makeup and fleet balance, and how that then also fits into the sort of perhaps continuation in terms of what it is that the roles that the Royal Australian Navy fulfills. And so when you look at what actually happened, the initial interest from the Royal Australian Navy in aircraft carriers, significant aircraft carriers, sort of starts in about 1944. They had operated aviation before, HMAS Albatross in the interwar period as a seaplane tender. But in terms of fixed wing, proper carrier-based aviation, it sort of kicks off in terms of interest in 1944 when the British offer to loan the RAN a vessel that they can't crew and ask the RAN to crew it. The RAN are absolutely dead set excited at this, and the politicians turn around and say no, because Cabinet is deeply suspicious of British motives, and they think that the POMs are trying to kind of get one over on the Australians. It then also falls apart a little bit later in terms of the precise capabilities that are actually needed as the Commonwealth begins to really focus its attention on Japan. But again, it's quite interesting there that the issues around personnel and the issues around alliance relationships, even within some of the closest alliances. The basic point, though, remains that as the Defence Committee in 1945, they produce a big report basically saying, what do we need? What does the Defence Force, as we'd now call it, need to look like in a post-war era? One of the absolutely central elements of that is the requirement for what they describe as a balanced fleet that includes task forces based around carriers and a fleet train to support them. So these two elements of aircraft carriers and supporting fleet train, again, something that's interesting and keeps on cropping up, was seen absolutely as core in any post-war Navy. Issues and politics, a lot of politics around this, particularly around where to get it from and who's going to pay for it. And the Navy eventually kind of presents something of an ultimatum to Cabinet, saying that what the question they're looking at is a question of whether or not you intend to have a modern Navy, is the quote that they use. If you want a modern Navy, basically you need carriers. And so you're seeing the technology evolve, But the idea of what it is that a navy does is perhaps more sort of continues through or runs through. The British offer the Australians 2 vessels for the price of 1. They've got 2 half-built vessels on the stocks that they don't want to finish in the post-war era, and so they offer the British 2 light fleet carriers, as they're known, sort of around 20,000-ton vessels. And they say you can have 2 for the price of 1. Navy thinks this is a great deal. Government is less sure, and to be fair on government, they are kind of right in this, because whilst it was a great deal, what happens over the time these vessels are being sort of finished and completed in Britain is that the technology around naval aviation develops incredibly rapidly. And so you move from prop aircraft increasingly to jet aircraft. You're seeing interest in angled decks is one of the things that's being developed, and the drive for jet aircraft increases weight, which then drives the need for steam catapults and all sorts of things like this. And this all means that you need to, as these changes happen, you need to redesigning the vessels and then rebuilding them, and costs escalate dramatically. In the end, Australia does get HMAS Sydney pretty much in original form, and the plan is to distinctly sort of modify HMAS Melbourne much more significantly to make it more suited to modern environments. But these things cost a huge amount more, and the capability that they offer is increasingly actually not necessarily all that the Navy wants. And one of the real challenges for Navy is to accept that these things are not full fleet carriers. And that they don't offer some of the real capability that Navy wants. And in terms of particularly strike, so the Royal Australian Navy has often had issues in terms of getting real offensive capability. And
Sounds familiar.
This was another time when that was the case. And indeed, it got to the stage where Roy Dowling, one of the Chiefs of Naval Staff, pushes really hard for them to get nukes. Because this is the way in which he believes that the aircraft carriers can get sufficient strike capability. Unsurprisingly, that doesn't go very far, but it shows kind of the degree to which the Royal Australian Navy is pushing and being challenged by the limits of technology and the constraints of budget, which are, I think, perennial issues. These carriers serve a hugely important purpose for the Royal Australian Navy throughout the Cold War. HMAS Sydney famously, of course, deploys to Korea in 1951 and serves with considerable distinction there. So really important capability, very much a contested capability in terms of their acquisition, and something that remains contested throughout their life because of the cost. And the concern that the Fleet Air Arm will eat the rest of the Navy, which again is something that is a recurrent theme in a small Navy that tries to do lots of things, and there are similar current concerns, I think, around submarines. So I think you can see some really interesting parallels.
To be fair, there were those concerns when the LHDs were also acquired briefly. They certainly ate the cuttable car park, that's for sure. But look, I think it's really interesting. So thank you for that. I think that too often in Australian strategic thinking, and Dib remarked on this in his review in '86, and we haven't progressed a lot further. We become very kind of, well, this is the capability we have, and so therefore it's a like-for-like replacement. And as much as we've announced the expansion of the surface combatant fleet in the 30s, in some ways it's still like-for-like capability replacement. And I do think that there's a wider step back to think about what are the capabilities that we really need, and I was disappointed to see the mine countermeasure vessel removed from the investment program. And I still think when you look at things like protection of subsea cables, etc., I don't think there's that wider conversation of, okay, yeah, we need frigates and destroyers, but what are the other, what's the whole set of capabilities? And I think that the AUKUS announcement and the fleet review being so narrow focused really hasn't helped this thinking.
Yes. Well, it comes back to the question, what do you want the Navy to do, right? And that's, I think, ultimately the question that we haven't really answered.
We better wrap it up. Now, we are still working on, we need to do some more work on what we announced last week, that we would be digging into the hellscape on a specifically dedicated podcast. So we don't have a date for that, but we will do that. But Richard, great to chat.
Always.
And
as
Richard.
ever, Maritime matters.
Maritime
Speak
matters.
soon.
Yes, it does.
Cheers, Jen.
Right, cheers. Have a good day.